I am Clara, 33 years old. My husband whipped me 5 times because his silver-tongued mistress claimed I scratched her sports car. I took every strike in dead silence, memorizing the exact tone of his voice as he called me a penniless parasite. 5 minutes later, I made a single encrypted phone call to my billionaire father to detonate a trap that would vaporize my husband's entire $500 million empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly gather your strength to completely destroy the people who broke you. The brutal crack of heavy leather slicing through the air echoed off the ceiling of our master bedroom. Then came the blinding sting across my shoulder blades. Strike number 5. The final one. Jason stood towering over me, his chest heaving with exertion, the thick designer belt gripped tightly in his right fist. I remained on my knees on the cold hardwood floor, my gaze fixed dead ahead on the Persian rug. The pain radiating across my back was agonizing, but I refused to scream. I refused to let a single tear fall. Crying was exactly what they wanted. Naomi, his 25-year-old director of public relations, leaned casually against the mahogany doorframe. She wore one of Jason's oversized dress shirts and held a crystal glass filled with my expensive vintage Cabernet. She took a slow sip, letting the dark liquid coat her lips, before flashing a satisfied smirk in my direction. She had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Just an hour ago, she walked into my home and dramatically claimed I intentionally keyed the passenger door of her new luxury car in the company parking lot. It was a blatant lie. I had not been within 10 miles of their corporate office all day. I had been working from my home office, analyzing financial spreadsheets. Objective facts did not matter in this house anymore. Only Naomi's words mattered. Jason threw the leather belt onto the unmade bed with a loud thud. He paced back and forth, his face flushed red with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, yelling that I was nothing but a penniless data nerd, a worthless anchor dragging down his limitless potential. He screamed about how he was the brilliant chief executive officer of the most successful logistics startup in the state. He proudly reminded me that he was exactly 3 days away from closing a massive $200 million initial public offering funding round. According to him, he was about to become a tech titan while I was just a quiet nobody crunching useless numbers for pennies. He turned his arrogant gaze toward Naomi, his expression softening immediately. He told me Naomi was the true genius who elevated his brand, possessing the visionary public relations strategies that made his company attractive to Wall Street investors. He praised her youth and endless ambition, contrasting every compliment he gave her with another vicious insult hurled directly at me. I was a parasite. He claimed a woman who only stayed married to him to eventually leech off his impending fortune. I tasted sharp copper in my mouth where I had bitten down hard on the inside of my cheek to stop myself from reacting. Every vile insult he hurled, every arrogant step he took, every single drop of stolen wine. Naomi swallowed. I logged away meticulously in my mind. Jason thought I was just a submissive woman who would absorb his abuse forever because I had nowhere else to go. He genuinely believed his own delusions of grandeur. But I was a senior forensic data analyst. My entire professional career was built on tracking hidden inconsistencies, exposing complex financial fraud, unearthing buried patterns, and building airtight, inescapable cases that routinely crushed highly sophisticated white-collar criminals. Jason thought he was an untouchable god simply because some wealthy venture capitalists liked his shiny presentation deck and promised to fund his logistical dreams. He had no idea who he was really married to. He had no idea the massive pile of institutional money he was desperately chasing actually belonged to my own family. For years, I deliberately chose to live under the radar. I wanted to build my independent career without relying on my father's immense Wall Street wealth. I wanted to prove I could succeed in the corporate world on my own merits without the shadow of the Caldwell family empire paving my way. When I met Jason, I introduced myself as just Clara, a humble data analyst. He never bothered to look deeper, never cared to ask about my roots because he was consumed by his own overwhelming ego. Now kneeling on the floor with my back burning, our marriage was completely shattered. The man I supported through the early days of his startup, whose initial business models I secretly optimized late at night, had violently turned on me for a manipulative mistress who cared only about his wealth. I kept my breathing steady. I calculated the exact variables of the situation. Anger was a messy emotion, and I did not deal in messes. I dealt in pure data. I watched Naomi take a sip of wine, her eyes glittering as she surveyed my battered posture. She thought she had won. She thought she successfully broke the plain wife and secured her place beside a billionaire. They both believed I was powerless. They thought they could discard me, physically assault me, and walk away clean to enjoy their multi-million-dollar triumph. I slowly lowered my trembling hands to rest quietly in my lap. Hidden inside the pocket of my blazer was my customized recording pen, its green light steadily pulsing, capturing every single word of his abusive tirade and her complicit laughter. The trap was already set and they were walking right into it. Jason angrily tossed the thick leather belt aside, its heavy buckle clattering against our mahogany nightstand. He walked over to his bespoke leather briefcase resting on the velvet armchair. The sharp snap of the golden clasps opening sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence of the bedroom. He pulled out a thick manila folder and marched back toward me. With a flick of his wrist, he threw a stack of crisp legal documents directly at my face. The heavy paper fluttered down, landing on the plush cream carpet right next to a small, fresh drop of my own blood. Divorce papers. The stark black text glared up at me, demanding my complete surrender. Jason stood over me, his shadow swallowing my kneeling form. He crossed his arms over his chest, adopting the exact intimidating posture he used during hostile corporate takeovers. He laid out my options with terrifying precision. Sign the papers immediately and walk out the front door tonight with absolutely zero marital assets, or prepare for a bloodbath. He promised to hire the most ruthless litigation firm in the state. He vowed to bury me in endless injunctions, freeze my meager bank accounts, and drag the proceedings out for years until I was completely destitute. He told me I would be living in a cardboard box on the streets long before I ever saw a single dime of his upcoming logistics fortune. He wanted me erased quickly and cheaply so he could step into his new billionaire lifestyle without the dead weight of a starter wife clinging to his ankle. Naomi pushed herself off the doorframe and glided into the center of the room. Her bare feet padded softly across the blood-stained carpet. She moved with an exaggerated sense of ownership, running her perfectly manicured fingers over the expensive oak dresser I had painstakingly restored by hand 2 years ago. She slowly paused by my vanity mirror, picking up a bottle of my favorite imported perfume, inspecting it with feigned interest before tossing it carelessly into the trash can. She looked down at me, her eyes overflowing with cruel amusement. She told me I needed to hurry up and pack my pathetic little bags because she had hired a luxury interior design team arriving first thing tomorrow morning. She loudly complained that the master bedroom was entirely too drab and practical for her taste. She wanted the walls painted a vibrant champagne, and she demanded my antique reading chair be thrown into the alley. She bragged about how Jason had promised her a massive walk-in closet renovation, funded entirely by the signing bonus from the $200 million funding round. She leaned down, bringing her face inches from mine, the smell of my own wine heavy on her breath. She whispered that she had already boxed up my kitchen utensils because she preferred eating out at Michelin-star restaurants anyway. Every word she spoke was deliberately calculated to inflict maximum emotional damage, to assert her absolute dominance over my home, my marriage, and my future. I did not flinch. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a verbal retaliation. I slowly pushed myself off the floor, gritting my teeth against the searing agony radiating from the fresh welts on my back. My muscles trembled with adrenaline, but my mind remained absolute ice. I carefully walked past Jason without breaking my gaze and pulled a simple black duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I unzipped it with steady hands. I did not take any jewelry. I did not take the expensive designer bags Jason had bought me during his brief phases of performative affection. I packed only the bare essentials: 3 plain shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, some basic toiletries, and my work laptop. I needed to portray the perfect picture of a broken, defeated woman fleeing in terror. As I reached into my blazer pocket to transfer my wallet, my fingers brushed against the sleek metal casing of my customized recording pen. The tiny green indicator light confirmed it had captured every single threat, every admission of financial manipulation, and the entire audio sequence of the physical assault. I deftly slipped the pen inside the inner lining of the duffel bag, hiding it beneath the fabric where Jason could never spot it. It was a standard tool for a forensic data analyst conducting undercover audits, but tonight, it was the first concrete brick in the foundation of their absolute ruin. I zipped the duffel bag closed and slung the strap over my uninjured shoulder. I walked back to the center of the room and crouched down to retrieve the divorce papers from the carpet. I placed them on the nightstand, picked up a standard ballpoint pen, and signed my name on the final page without a second of hesitation. I signed away the house, the cars, the shared bank accounts, and any claim to his logistics company. Jason let out a loud, arrogant breath of relief, clearly thrilled that his intimidation tactics had worked so flawlessly. He snatched the papers from the nightstand, clutching his fabricated victory tightly against his chest. I turned toward the bedroom exit. Naomi was blocking the doorway, standing with her arms crossed, waiting for me to lower my head in shame as I passed her. I stopped directly in front of her face. I slowly raised my head, making dead, unwavering eye contact with the woman who thought she had just stolen my life. I did not scowl. I did not glare. Instead, I let my lips slowly curve upward into a bright, chilling, completely compliant smile. It was a smile devoid of warmth, packed with a terrifying silent promise of total annihilation. Naomi's confident smirk instantly faltered. Her arms dropped to her sides, and she instinctively took a step backward, completely unsettled by the absolute calm radiating from my eyes. She expected to see a broken victim. She had no idea she was looking at her executioner. The pale morning light filtered through the living room blinds, casting sharp, elongated shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I had not slept a single second. I spent the entire night sitting rigidly on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, my packed black duffel bag resting quietly by my feet. Jason and Naomi had locked themselves inside the master bedroom upstairs, entirely unconcerned with my presence downstairs. They assumed they had completely broken my spirit. They believed I was paralyzed by fear, despair, and financial ruin, incapable of making a single move without their express permission. In reality, I was wide awake, calculating my next sequence of actions. I was simply waiting for the morning shift to arrive. I knew Jason's family dynamic perfectly. They functioned exactly like a pack of opportunistic scavengers. I knew the vultures would circle and arrive the very second they smelled blood in the water. I needed them to arrive. I needed their overwhelming arrogance to take center stage. The heavy oak front door suddenly swung open without a knock, slamming violently against the hallway wall. The loud, aggressive crash echoed through the quiet house, signaling the arrival of the cleanup crew. Beatrice, Jason's older sister, marched into the entryway, wearing a stark white designer trench coat and oversized, dark sunglasses. Right behind her strode her husband, Andre Thompson. Andre was a tall, imposing African-American man with a meticulously trimmed beard and a cold, calculating gaze. He wore a custom-tailored Armani suit that screamed Wall Street excess and unearned privilege. As the chief financial officer of Jason's rapidly expanding logistics company, Andre loved to project an aura of absolute dominance and untouchable wealth. Both of them carried thick, heavy-duty black garbage bags. They walked into my home as if they had already purchased it at an auction, their faces twisted into identical expressions of supreme superiority. They were here to execute Jason's dirty work. Beatrice did not even bother to offer a basic greeting. She aggressively dropped her expensive sunglasses into her leather purse, let out a loud theatrical sigh of disgust, and immediately walked toward my carefully organized bookshelves. She snapped open a black garbage bag with a sharp flick of her wrists and began violently swiping my favorite hardcover books right off the shelves. Novels, specialized reference guides, and framed family photographs tumbled into the plastic sack with heavy, careless thuds. "It is about time we get this cheap trash out of here," Beatrice announced, her shrill voice dripping with venomous glee. "I have been telling Jason for 5 grueling years that your taste is incredibly pathetic. You always made this expensive house look like a discount suburban thrift store. Naomi actually has an eye for true luxury. She understands the elite standard our family expects and deserves." She moved swiftly to the fireplace mantel, grabbing a delicate ceramic vase I had purchased during my honeymoon with Jason, and casually tossed it into the open garbage bag. The fragile ceramic shattered instantly upon impact. Beatrice laughed out loud, a harsh grating sound that filled the tense living room. She looked directly at me, clearly expecting me to burst into tears or beg her to stop destroying my cherished memories. She wanted a visible reaction. She desperately craved the emotional drama. I sat perfectly still. My hands remained folded politely and calmly in my lap. I did not offer her a single satisfying flinch. Beneath the lapel of my tailored black blazer, a microscopic camera lens rested silently, pointing directly at the two intruders. I subtly pressed my left arm against my side, pushing the small activation button completely hidden inside the silk lining of my jacket. A tiny, almost imperceptible vibration against my ribs confirmed the device was actively recording in full high definition, silently capturing both crystal-clear audio and video. As a senior forensic data analyst, securing undeniable evidence was my absolute specialty. Every arrogant smirk, every destructive physical action, every cruel word exiting their mouths was now being logged directly into a secure encrypted cloud server. Andre walked slowly into the center of the living room, casually tossing his empty garbage bags onto the glass coffee table. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated contempt. He deeply enjoyed seeing people beneath him. He thrived on the toxic power dynamic of kicking someone who had already been pushed to the ground. "Look at you," Andre sneered, shaking his head slowly in mock pity. "Sitting there like a pathetic stray dog waiting for a handout. You really thought you could play in the big leagues, Clara?" Andre continued, his voice booming with unearned authority. "You actually thought marrying Jason meant you belonged in our exclusive world, but you were never anything more than a temporary placeholder. A naive, simple-minded placeholder who clearly outlived her usefulness." I kept my expression completely blank, staring back at him without a single trace of emotion or fear. My profound silence only seemed to further fuel his massive, fragile ego. He took a deliberate step closer, towering over my seated form, wanting to ensure I felt the full, crushing weight of my supposed defeat. "You should be incredibly grateful we are even letting you walk out of here with that single duffel bag," he mocked. "Jason wanted to call building security and have you physically dragged out onto the front lawn for the neighbors to watch. I told him to let Beatrice handle the trash collection instead. It is much cleaner this way. We are doing you a massive favor by letting you leave quietly before your real financial execution finally begins. You have absolutely no idea what is coming next." Andre laughed, crossing his arms. Beatrice smiled brightly from across the room, proudly tossing another framed photograph into her bag. "And you never will, Clara, because people like you do not survive when powerful people decide it is time to erase you entirely." Andre chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that bounced off the high ceiling of the living room. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his tailored Armani suit, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. He thrived on the illusion of absolute control. He paced a tight circle in front of the coffee table, commanding the space like a seasoned corporate predator, preparing to deliver a final, devastating blow to a weakened rival. He genuinely believed I possessed the mental capacity of a naive child. To him, I was just a quiet, unassuming woman who spent her days staring at meaningless spreadsheets, completely oblivious to the complex, high-stakes games being played by the wealthy men around her. He wanted to crush any lingering hope I might have harbored about fighting back. He wanted to make sure I understood the absolute futility of my situation. You see, Clara, your biggest flaw was assuming the world operates on fairness. Andre began, his voice taking on the rhythmic lecturing cadence he used during shareholder meetings. You honestly thought a standard divorce proceeding would protect you. You assumed you would walk into a family court, bat your tearful eyes at a sympathetic judge, and walk away with half of Jason's company and half of this beautiful house. It is almost adorable how profoundly ignorant you are about how real money works. I kept my chin level, meeting his arrogant gaze without a single tremor of fear. My silence was the perfect catalyst. Narcissists like Andre cannot stand a quiet audience. They despise an emotional void because it deprives them of their twisted validation. To fill that void, they inevitably start talking. They start bragging. They hand over the exact ammunition required for their own demise. Let me offer you a free lesson in high-level wealth management, Andre sneered, leaning slightly over the glass coffee table to ensure I caught every single word of his impending confession. As the chief financial officer of a company currently valued at $500 million, protecting the founder's assets is my primary directive. Did you actually believe Jason and I would leave millions of dollars sitting in joint domestic accounts, waiting for you to stake a claim? We are miles ahead of you. Over the last 8 months, I systematically liquidated every single liquid asset connected to your marriage. I funneled all the cash from your shared portfolios, the equity from your investment properties, and the initial pre-IPO dividends directly into a labyrinth of offshore holding companies. Beatrice paused her destructive rampage through my belongings, turning around to smile proudly at her husband's ruthless financial maneuvering. Andre fed off her admiration, his chest puffing out beneath his expensive suit jacket. I established 3 separate shell trusts in the Cayman Islands, Andre continued, his voice dripping with intoxicating arrogance. I layered the transfers through a series of anonymous corporate entities registered in Delaware and Nevada, effectively masking the origin of every single dollar. To the Internal Revenue Service, to the domestic family courts, and to whatever discount divorce lawyer you managed to scrounge up those marital funds, simply evaporated. They do not exist. On paper, Jason is completely leveraged. On paper, you two possess absolutely zero shared wealth. My heart beat with a steady rhythmic precision. Every syllable exiting his mouth was a golden ticket. By explicitly detailing the utilization of wire transfers to move concealed funds across international borders for the purpose of defrauding a spouse and evading domestic taxation, Andre was neatly checking every required box for multiple federal financial crimes. He was handing me a pristine, unassailable confession to wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, massive corporate money laundering, and severe tax evasion. The hidden camera, nestled securely in my blazer, captured his face in crystal-clear high definition, while the microscopic microphone immortalized his smug admission of federal crimes. Andre stood tall, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets, ready to deliver his final crushing ultimatum. He wanted to ensure my complete submission. Now, here is the reality of your miserable situation, Andre commanded, his tone dropping into a vicious, menacing register. You signed those divorce papers last night, giving up your right to contest the division of assets. If you even think about hiring an attorney to challenge that signature, if you even attempt to subpoena our financial records, I will trigger the secondary phase of my strategy. During the asset liquidation process, I used your joint financial credentials to open a series of massive high-interest commercial credit lines. Right now, there is a fabricated debt of nearly $4 million sitting in corporate escrow tied directly to your marital estate. He let the staggering number hang in the air, watching my eyes to see if the terror had finally set in. If you walk away quietly right now, Jason and I will absorb that debt through the company's operational budget, Andre promised smoothly. You get to leave with your single duffel bag and start over at the bottom of the food chain where you belong. But if you fight us, if you raise a single red flag during this divorce, I will legally assign exactly half of that fabricated $4 million debt directly to your name. I will ruin your credit score for the rest of your natural life. Your wages will be garnished until you are dead. You will never be approved for a car loan, a mortgage, or a decent apartment ever again. You will be utterly crushed under the weight of a debt you can never repay. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh, tossing the last of my framed photographs into her garbage bag. Take the deal, Clara. Andre just gave you the only lifeline you are going to get. Take your pathetic little bag of cheap clothes and get out of my brother's house. I looked at the two of them standing in the middle of the living room. They believed they had conquered. They felt invincible. They felt untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that my hidden recording device had just secured enough evidence to lock them both inside a federal penitentiary for over a decade. Andre's brilliant foolproof Cayman Islands strategy was child's play for a senior forensic data analyst. I knew exactly which offshore banking portals to breach, which digital ledgers to cross-reference, and which federal agencies to notify. I slowly stood up from the sofa, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored trousers. I reached down and picked up my black duffel bag, sliding the heavy strap over my shoulder. I looked Andre dead in the eye, maintaining a perfectly neutral, defeated expression. I offered him a slow, compliant nod. I understand completely. I said, my voice quiet and subdued, projecting the exact image of a thoroughly broken woman. I will not contest the divorce. I will leave right now. Andre smirked, a look of profound satisfaction settling across his face. He stepped aside, making a sweeping, theatrical gesture toward the front door, granting me permission to exit my own home. I walked past him, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood, carrying the weapon that would soon obliterate his entire existence. I walked into the kitchen, the heavy black duffel bag weighing down my uninjured shoulder. Andre followed closely behind me, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He was entirely unwilling to let his moment of supreme corporate triumph end. He reached inside his tailored Armani jacket and pulled out a secondary legal document, slapping it down aggressively onto the cool granite surface of the kitchen island. It was a comprehensive asset forfeiture addendum, a supplementary contract designed to completely insulate his offshore shell companies from any future domestic audits. It was the final legal nail in my manufactured financial coffin. "Sign the addendum, Clara," Andre commanded, tapping a manicured finger against the signature line. "This waiver explicitly states you relinquish all rights to request financial discovery during the dissolution of your marriage to Jason. It guarantees you walk away with zero claims to the logistics company. Sign it now, and I will graciously ensure that fabricated $4 million debt never attaches to your Social Security number." I kept my chin lowered, playing the role of the defeated, humiliated wife to absolute perfection. I reached across the granite island and picked up a silver pen. I forced my hand to tremble slightly as I brought the tip of the pen to the heavy paper. I wanted to give them the exact performance of a broken, terrified woman they desperately craved. I scratched my signature across the bottom line, finalizing my complete surrender in their eyes. Beatrice leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, swirling an imaginary glass of wine in her hand, her face contorted into a vicious sneer. She watched me cap the pen with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not let the front door hit you on the way out." Beatrice laughed, her shrill voice echoing through the open kitchen. "And do not even think about asking to wait inside the foyer for your ride. Call an Uber from the curb. Naomi hired a team of luxury interior designers, and they will be arriving here any minute to rip up those hideous carpets you picked out. I absolutely refuse to let your pathetic, poverty-stricken energy ruin the aesthetic of their first consultation." Andre snatched the signed addendum off the counter, folding it neatly and tucking it back inside his suit jacket. He had his prize. He had his absolute protection. He gave me a dismissive wave toward the entryway, treating me like a stray animal being shooed off the property. I turned away from them without speaking a single word. I walked down the short hallway, grasped the cold brass handle of the front door, and pulled it open. A violent gust of freezing rain immediately whipped across my face. The sky overhead was a bruised, turbulent gray, unleashing a torrential downpour that quickly flooded the manicured suburban lawns. The icy wind cut sharply through my thin blazer, sending a vicious jolt of agony radiating across the 5 open whip marks on my back. I gritted my teeth against the searing pain. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, severing my physical connection to that house of horrors forever. I did not pull out my phone to order an Uber. I did not huddle under the small porch awning for shelter. I gripped the strap of my duffel bag tightly and walked straight down the concrete driveway, stepping directly into the freezing downpour. The icy rain instantly soaked through my clothes, chilling my skin, but my mind remained a furnace of pure, calculated vengeance. I marched down the quiet, affluent suburban street, my wet shoes slapping against the flooded pavement. The wealthy neighborhood was entirely silent, the massive houses standing like ignorant monuments to domestic illusion. Every step I took away from Jason's house was a deliberate calculation. I needed to move exactly 2 blocks away to clear the residential security cameras monitoring the cul-de-sac. I needed a complete blind spot for my extraction. The rain plastered my hair to my face and neck. The freezing water ran down my spine, stinging the raw wounds Jason had inflicted, but the physical discomfort meant nothing. The pain was merely data. It was the crucial evidence required to lock my abusive husband inside a federal penitentiary cell. I reached the designated intersection exactly 2 blocks away from the property line. I stopped under the heavy canopy of an old oak tree completely hidden from the view of my former home. I stood perfectly still in the freezing rain waiting. Less than 30 seconds later, the quiet suburban atmosphere was violently shattered by the deep synchronized rumble of massive engines. A terrifying convoy of 3 identical armored pitch-black Cadillac Escalades turned the corner in tight militaristic formation. The heavy vehicles dominated the narrow street, their heavily tinted windows offering zero visibility into the interiors. The convoy moved with frightening precision, braking aggressively, and forming a solid, impenetrable barricade entirely blocking the intersection. The heavy doors of the lead and rear vehicles burst open simultaneously. 6 highly trained private security contractors stepped out into the torrential rain. They wore identical tailored black suits, discreet communication earpieces, and carried themselves with the lethal, intimidating posture of former elite military operators. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency, immediately securing the perimeter of the street. The head of the security detail, a towering man with a severe, scarred face, strode directly toward me. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer useless sympathy. He held a massive black umbrella over my head, instantly shielding me from the freezing rain, and gave a sharp, respectful nod. "Miss Caldwell." The security chief set his voice a low, commanding rumble that easily cut through the sound of the storm. "Your father sent us. The perimeter is secure. We are ready for immediate extraction." I looked at the imposing security contractor, feeling the heavy, suffocating facade of the battered, penniless wife melt away into the icy puddles at my feet. I reached into my soaked duffel bag, my fingers sliding past the cheap clothes, to retrieve the only item possessing any actual value. I pulled out my customized silver recording pen, the device containing the audio confession of Andre's offshore financial fraud and the brutal documentation of Jason's physical assault. I held the metallic cylinder tightly in my palm, feeling the cool, solid weight of their impending destruction. I dropped the black duffel bag directly onto the flooded sidewalk, abandoning the cheap clothes and the fabricated identity I had maintained for 5 long years. "Leave the bag," I commanded, my voice stripping away the quiet submission I had played all morning, revealing the cold, absolute authority of a billionaire heiress preparing for war. "I have everything I need right here." The security chief immediately stepped back and pulled open the heavy armored door of the center Escalade. The interior radiated warmth, smelling of rich leather and expensive cedar. I stepped up into the luxurious cabin, sinking into the plush, heated leather seat. The heavy armored door slammed shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud, instantly cutting off the sound of the freezing rain and completely sealing me inside my true reality. The convoy of black SUVs immediately accelerated, their massive tires gripping the wet asphalt as they executed a flawless, synchronized departure from the suburban neighborhood. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest, the recording pen resting securely in my lap. Jason, Naomi, Andre, and Beatrice were sitting inside that house, drinking expensive coffee and laughing about my spectacular downfall. They believed they had just successfully discarded a worthless, penniless nobody. They had absolutely no idea they had just unleashed an apex predator. The armored convoy sped through the torrential rain, leaving the suffocating suburban illusion far behind. The rhythmic hum of the Escalade's massive engine masked the storm outside. I stared out the tinted window, watching the dull gray houses fade into a rapid blur of highway concrete. Within 40 minutes, the iconic towering skyline of Manhattan loomed ahead, cutting through the heavy clouds like a jagged crown of glass and steel. We descended into the subterranean belly of an exclusive, ultra-secure skyscraper situated deep in the heart of the financial district. The convoy bypassed the standard resident parking, rolling smoothly into a restricted private garage, accessible only to the building's highest tier of ownership. The security chief flanked me as I stepped out of the heavy vehicle and approached a private express elevator. A retinal scan and a biometric fingerprint confirmed my identity in a fraction of a second. The thick stainless steel doors slid shut, and the cabin shot upward, bypassing 80 floors without a single stop. When the doors finally chimed open, I stepped directly into my actual home. The $15 million penthouse spanned the entire top floor, a sprawling masterpiece of cold, unapologetic luxury. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the dark storm raging across the city. The floors were carved from flawless dark marble, reflecting the muted, sophisticated lighting above. Sleek, minimalist furniture imported exclusively from Milan filled the massive living space, devoid of any personal sentimental clutter. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the fake, suffocating domesticity I had endured for the past 5 years. There were no cheap oak dressers here. There were no compromised lives. This was a fortress built entirely on absolute, unyielding financial power. Standing in the center of the expansive living area was my private medical team. 2 highly discreet trauma specialists clad in immaculate scrubs waited with a mobile medical bay, already prepped and waiting. I did not greet them. I simply removed my soaked blazer and unbuttoned my ruined shirt, letting the wet, heavy fabric drop carelessly to the pristine marble floor. I turned my back to them, exposing the raw, brutal reality of my toxic marriage. The lead physician stepped forward, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before his intense professional training took over. He did not ask questions. He did not offer any unwanted pity. He simply activated a high-definition medical camera, meticulously photographing every angle, every bruise, and every bloody welt Jason had viciously inflicted. The high-resolution flash illuminated the massive, pristine room, documenting the savage physical assault with chilling clinical precision. Once the visual evidence was legally secured, the medical team went to work. The sting of antiseptic wash biting into the open wounds was sharp and vicious, but I stood completely motionless, staring blankly out at the towering Manhattan skyline. The pain was merely a biological response. It was entirely irrelevant to my upcoming objective. The doctor carefully stitched the deepest cuts and applied medical-grade dermal bandages, sealing the physical trauma away beneath sterile white patches. The sheer juxtaposition was striking. My physical body bore the ugly, violent markings of a desperate, abusive man, yet my surroundings screamed of supreme, untouchable privilege. I was standing in a $15 million sanctuary receiving elite medical care that his pathetic logistics company could never afford to buy. Jason thought he had physically broken a helpless woman, unaware that he had just provided a billionaire heiress with the physical evidence required to lock him inside a federal prison cage. After the medical team finished their meticulous work and quietly exited the penthouse, I walked toward my dedicated workstation. It was a massive curved glass desk holding 4 interconnected high-resolution monitors linked directly to an encrypted off-the-grid server farm located 2 floors below. This was the ultimate command center of a senior forensic data analyst. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair, feeling the stiff pull of the fresh bandages stretching tightly across my back. I placed the silver recording pen onto the transparent glass surface. The device looked small and unassuming, yet it held enough destructive power to obliterate a $500 million corporate valuation. I twisted the top of the pen, revealing the hidden hardware connector, and plugged it directly into the heavily encrypted port on my main console. The massive monitors instantly flared to life, casting a cold, crisp blue glow across my face. Progress bars rapidly filled the digital screens as the audio and video files began extracting from the hidden device. I watched as the high-definition footage of Andre Thompson standing in my former living room rendered onto the central monitor. His arrogant voice echoed through the pristine penthouse surround sound speakers, bragging endlessly about his brilliant Cayman Islands shell corporations and his fabricated credit debts. Next to his video, the audio waveform of Jason screaming his abusive insults and the unmistakable violent crack of the leather belt materialized in stark, jagged lines. I heard Naomi laughing in the background, her cruel, oblivious taunts captured in flawless digital clarity. I dragged the raw files into a highly secure prosecution folder, meticulously categorizing every single admission of federal wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, and aggravated assault. I isolated the exact timestamps where Andre explicitly detailed his international money laundering strategies. I separated the audio file of the physical beating, saving it as a standalone piece of indisputable criminal evidence. The data was absolutely perfect. The evidence was entirely absolute. My abusive husband and his greedy, parasitic family had handed me the exact weapons I needed to orchestrate their total destruction. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold wave of profound satisfaction washing over me. The trap was fully loaded, and I was finally ready to pull the trigger. I reached across the massive glass desk and activated the dedicated biometric terminal on my left. A heavily encrypted communication interface flickered to life on the secondary monitor, establishing a direct, untraceable uplink to the executive suites of the Caldwell Tower. The digital connection routed through 3 separate international servers before finalizing the secure handshake. I did not have to wait long. Within 4 seconds, the stark black screen dissolved into a crisp, high-definition video feed. Harrison Caldwell sat behind a sprawling desk, carved from a single slab of black obsidian. My father wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair impeccably styled, projecting the exact aura of absolute financial authority that made him a feared titan on Wall Street. He paused his review of a printed financial prospectus and looked directly into the camera. His piercing gray eyes instantly locked onto the sterile white medical bandages partially visible beneath the collar of my silk robe. His expression did not change, but the sudden tightening of his jaw revealed the lethal protective anger simmering just beneath his polished corporate exterior. He knew immediately that the suburban experiment was completely over. "Dad, you were right about Jason," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotional fragility. "I am done hiding. Initiate the Apex protocol." Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather executive chair, steepling his fingers together. He did not offer any useless sympathy or demand a tearful explanation regarding my injuries. We were Caldwells. We communicated in the language of strategic execution and market dominance. I assume the domestic illusion has finally outlived its operational utility, Harrison replied, his voice a low, commanding rumble that echoed perfectly through my penthouse speakers. "I warned you 5 years ago that Jason Cole possessed the raw ambition of a corporate climber, but completely lacked the intellectual bandwidth required to actually sustain an enterprise. He is a reckless gambler pretending to be a visionary. I take it his profound arrogance finally resulted in a critical miscalculation." A critical miscalculation is a massive understatement. I confirmed, pulling up the isolated audio files I had just extracted from my recording pen. Jason decided to forcefully evict me from the marital home this morning to make room for his 25-year-old public relations director. During the eviction process, his deeply incompetent brother-in-law, Andre Thompson, decided to gloat about his financial maneuvers. Andre explicitly detailed his methodology for siphoning marital assets and operational funds into Cayman Island shell trusts. Harrison let out a sharp, cynical laugh. Andre Thompson is the chief financial officer of a logistics startup teetering on the edge of a public offering, and he is utilizing basic offshore holding companies to hide capital. That is not just financial negligence, Clara. That is corporate suicide. Does Andre realize he is actively defrauding the exact Wall Street institution, preparing to inject $200 million into their Series C funding round? Andre is entirely oblivious, I stated, pulling up the proprietary Apex Holding investment portfolio on my primary screen. Jason and his entire pathetic family firmly believe I am just a quiet, disposable data entry clerk. They have absolutely no idea that Apex Holding, the massive financial conglomerate holding their entire corporate future in the palm of its hand, belongs completely to you. And they certainly have no idea that I am the lead forensic auditor for Apex Holding, directly responsible for approving their final capital injection. The sheer scale of Jason's ignorance was staggering. For 8 stressful months, Jason had been tirelessly courting Apex Holding, begging for the $200 million cash injection required to push his logistics company through an initial public offering. He had flown to New York, delivered sweating presentations to low-level Apex executives, and celebrated every minor email response as a massive personal victory. He genuinely believed he had conquered the financial world. He never once suspected that the invisible billionaire owner of Apex Holding was his own father-in-law, or that the final risk assessment auditor holding the execution key to the entire deal was the very wife he was actively abusing at home. The Apex protocol is now fully authorized, Harrison declared, his tone shifting into absolute predatory focus. We are not just going to pull the $200 million funding offer, Clara. Simply withdrawing our capital allows them the opportunity to secure alternative financing. We are going to digitally obliterate that company from the inside out. I want every single investor, every corporate stakeholder, and every federal regulatory agency to witness their complete financial disembowelment. I am already compiling the destructive payload, I explained, my fingers flying rapidly across the illuminated keyboard as I initiated the first wave of automated data decryption. I am currently mirroring the entire database of Andre's offshore accounts. He used his corporate credentials to move those funds, which means I can legally tie his personal money laundering directly to the company's operational budget. Once I expose that catastrophic financial hole, the Securities and Exchange Commission will immediately flag their upcoming initial public offering as a massive fraudulent enterprise. Excellent, Harrison nodded approvingly, his eyes tracking the scrolling data streams I was actively pushing to his secure monitor. Jason scheduled a massive signing gala for tomorrow evening. He invited the press, his board of directors, and every major tech investor in the tri-state area to watch him officially sign the Apex Holding acquisition contract. He intends to use our capital injection to cover up whatever massive deficits Andre created in their operational budget. Then we will let him throw his party, I replied, a cold, calculating smile touching my lips. We will let Jason and Naomi stand on that stage and bask in their fabricated glory. We will let them feel completely invincible right up until the exact second I walk through those ballroom doors. I want Jason to look down from the podium and realize the destitute wife he beat and threw into the freezing rain is the actual architect of his total destruction. Harrison's eyes glinted with undeniable pride. As the lead forensic auditor for Apex Holding, you possess the unilateral authority to trigger a breach of contract clause. You will not only terminate the $200 million acquisition on the spot, but you will also execute the immediate recall of the $15 million short-term bridge loan Apex provided them last quarter. A bridge loan they have already entirely squandered. I added, securing the final data packets into the centralized prosecution folder. When I demand immediate repayment at the gala tomorrow night, Jason will be forced to default in front of his entire board of directors. The logistics company will become instantly insolvent. Their corporate valuation will freefall to zero in real time. Prepare the final documentation, Clara. Harrison instructed, his hand resting firmly on the obsidian desk. I will arrange the private security detail and handle the coordination with our contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tomorrow night we do not just break them, we eradicate them completely. Understood, I said, terminating the encrypted video link. The screen faded to black, leaving me alone in the silent, sprawling penthouse. The physical pain in my back was completely overshadowed by the intoxicating rush of impending vengeance. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. I had exactly 24 hours to dismantle a $500 million lie. 30 miles away inside the sleek glass headquarters of Jason's logistics startup, Naomi was busy treating her new title like a royal decree. She marched through the open-plan office wearing a pair of red designer stilettos she had purchased just hours after my violent eviction. As the newly self-appointed vice president of communications, she demanded absolute submission from employees who possessed a decade more experience than her. She stopped at the cubicle of a senior marketing manager, slamming a heavy stack of quarterly performance reports onto the desk. She loudly berated the woman for using the wrong shade of blue on a presentation slide, threatening to fire her on the spot if she ever embarrassed the company again. Naomi reveled in the fear she inspired. She walked into her expansive corner office, dropping her counterfeit luxury handbag onto the pristine white leather sofa. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and pulled out her smartphone. She needed to ensure I was suffering. She needed to rub her fabricated victory directly into my wounds. She opened our message thread and began typing a flurry of vicious, gloating texts, desperate to force a reaction out of a woman she believed was entirely broken. Naomi kicked her bare feet up onto her massive mahogany desk, using Jason's platinum corporate credit card to order imported Italian marble countertops for the kitchen she had just destroyed. She giggled aloud, snapping a screenshot of the $60,000 digital receipt and sending it directly to my phone. She typed another message bragging that Jason was planning to propose to her with a 5-carat diamond ring the very second the Apex holding contract was signed at the gala tomorrow night. There was a picture of my former living room, the space completely gutted by the luxury design team she had hired. Another photo showed my carefully cultivated indoor garden being ripped out by landscapers. Her accompanying text mocked my supposedly pathetic existence, boasting that Jason had given her an unlimited budget to scrub every remaining trace of my cheap, depressing energy from the property. She strutted out of her office to demand a fresh oat milk latte from a terrified intern, shouting across the floor that the company was about to be worth $500 million, making her virtually untouchable. She paraded her unearned power, entirely blind to the fact that her corporate kingdom was a hollow shell built on massive, precarious lies. Back in the silent sanctuary of my Manhattan penthouse, my phone vibrated aggressively against the cold glass surface of my workstation. I did not flinch. I glanced down at the illuminated screen, watching Naomi's malicious messages roll in one after another. I did not block her number. I did not reply. I simply muted the notifications and turned my absolute focus back to the 4 massive monitors glowing in front of me. Naomi was playing a petty game of interior design, completely unaware that I was actively seizing control of the actual building blocks of her entire reality. I initiated a brute force decryption sequence targeting the offshore banking portals Andre had bragged about. Andre considered himself a financial mastermind, but his digital footprint was shockingly amateurish. He had used a standardized virtual private network to access the Cayman Island shell trusts, leaving a glaring trail of breadcrumbs directly tied to his corporate IP address. I launched a proprietary algorithm designed by Apex Holding to bypass standard banking firewalls. Lines of complex code rapidly cascaded down my secondary screen as the algorithm hammered against the offshore security protocols. Andre had structured the holding companies under a fake corporate umbrella registered in Nevada, but he had lazily reused the same administrative passwords he utilized for the startup's internal payroll system. It was a catastrophic security flaw. Within 45 minutes, the offshore firewall collapsed entirely. I was in. My main monitor flashed bright green as the encrypted ledgers of the Cayman Island accounts fully rendered on my screen. I began dissecting the digital spreadsheets with surgical precision. The financial devastation was far worse than I had initially calculated. Andre had not just hidden marital assets to screw me over in a divorce. He had systematically embezzled a staggering $50 million directly from the logistics company's operational budget over the last 14 months. I traced the massive wire transfers tracking the stolen capital as it flowed from the startup's domestic payroll accounts into the offshore holding companies. Andre had been desperately falsifying the quarterly revenue reports to hide the massive deficit from Jason and the board of directors. I meticulously mapped out the entire intricate network of financial crimes, downloading every single digital receipt, every heavily forged invoice, and every illicit international wire transfer directly onto an encrypted secure external solid-state drive. Jason was an arrogant fool, but Andre was an active corporate predator. They were entirely dependent on the $200 million capital injection from Apex Holding to silently plug the $50 million hole Andre had created before the Securities and Exchange Commission initiated their mandatory pre-IPO audit. If that funding fell through, the company would not just fail to launch, it would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation into corporate embezzlement and tax evasion. I smiled coldly at the glowing data. Naomi was currently picking out imported marble for a house that was about to be seized by federal authorities. Jason was confidently planning to buy a massive 5-carat diamond ring for his mistress, using the exact corporate funds he was currently and actively stealing from his own oblivious investors. I compiled the final financial dossier, meticulously organizing the evidence of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate malfeasance. The digital weapon I had engineered was now fully loaded, primed, and completely lethal. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the brutal truth of their impending destruction wash over me. The final 24-hour countdown to the signing gala had officially begun, and these miserable parasites had absolutely no way out of the impending slaughter. Inside the heavily soundproofed executive suite of the logistics startup, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Jason paced aggressively back and forth across the imported wool rug, his expensive Italian leather shoes leaving heavy indentations with every angry step. His normally pristine and confident appearance was completely unraveling. He had loosened his silk tie, unbuttoned his collar, and dark patches of sweat stained the underarms of his tailored shirt. He gripped a thick stack of printed financial projections, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the glaring red numbers, highlighting a catastrophic deficit. Andre sat rigidly on the edge of the luxury leather sofa, his usual arrogant posture replaced by a tight defensive crouch. The polished chief financial officer was visibly sweating repeatedly, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. The high-definition flat screen on the wall displayed the upcoming agenda for the initial public offering, a massive milestone that was currently sitting directly on top of a financial landmine. Jason threw the stack of papers violently onto his massive oak desk. The papers slid across the polished surface, scattering onto the floor like dead leaves. He turned toward his brother-in-law, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute rage and profound terror. He demanded to know how a $50 million void had materialized in their primary operating budget mere hours before the most critical signing gala of their lives. He shouted that the Securities and Exchange Commission was scheduled to initiate their mandatory compliance audit on Monday morning. If the auditors found a missing $50 million, they would call the federal authorities and lock both of them inside a concrete cell for the rest of their natural lives. Andre stood up quickly, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to placate his panicking chief executive officer. He insisted that Jason needed to lower his voice and maintain his composure. Andre stepped closer to the desk, speaking in a harsh, hurried whisper. He explicitly reminded Jason that the missing $50 million was the exact reason they were currently valued at $500 million. Andre had systematically siphoned those operational funds through the Cayman Island shell trusts over the past 14 months to artificially inflate their vendor payment history and falsify their international shipping volume. The massive embezzlement was not just simple theft, It was a highly coordinated financial manipulation designed specifically to trick Wall Street investors into believing the logistics startup was experiencing explosive growth. Andre pointed a shaking finger at the scattered documents, arguing that without those fabricated metrics, Apex Holding would have never even looked at their portfolio, let alone offered them a $200 million capital injection. Jason grabbed the edge of his desk, leaning his weight against the heavy wood as he struggled to control his panic. He ran his trembling hands through his hair, cursing loudly. He told Andre that hiding my marital assets during the divorce was supposed to be a simple, clean operation. He never authorized Andre to jeopardize the entire corporate structure by moving $50 million of actual investor capital across international borders. Jason hissed that he was a brilliant visionary, not a common street criminal. He built this logistics platform from nothing, and he completely refused to lose his impending billionaire status because his chief financial officer got greedy with the offshore accounts. Andre let out a sharp, mocking laugh, his own fear transforming into vicious defensive anger. He stepped right up to Jason, jabbing his index finger into Jason's chest. He told Jason to drop the innocent genius routine immediately. Andre reminded him that Jason was the one who demanded a skyrocketing valuation to impress the venture capitalists. Jason was the one who explicitly ordered the finance department to make the numbers look spectacular by any means necessary. Andre firmly stated that he simply executed the exact corporate fraud Jason had demanded. The offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands were just a convenient vehicle to serve two purposes at once. They successfully starved me out of my rightful divorce settlement, and they provided the perfect digital smokescreen to hide the massive corporate deficit until the Apex Holding money officially cleared. The reality of their impending doom hung heavily in the air of the executive suite. They were two arrogant men standing on a rapidly crumbling cliff, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one holding the explosive detonator. Jason turned away, staring blankly out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city below. His entire empire was a fragile house of cards, and a massive hurricane was rapidly approaching. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force his heart rate back down to a manageable level. He turned back to Andre, his expression hardening into a mask of desperate resolve. Jason commanded Andre to confirm absolutely that the Apex Holding representatives suspected nothing. Andre quickly smoothed his suit jacket, desperately grasping at the remnants of his shattered professional confidence. He promised Jason that the offshore firewalls were completely impenetrable. He swore on his life that the corporate auditors from Apex Holding had swallowed the falsified revenue reports without asking a single difficult question. Andre insisted that the Wall Street analysts were totally incapable of detecting his sophisticated international money laundering. He assured Jason that tomorrow night at the signing gala, the $200 million wire transfer would immediately hit their domestic accounts. The very second that money cleared, Andre would swiftly move $50 million back into the operating budget to cover the massive hole. By the time the federal regulators walked through their doors on Monday morning, the books would be pristine, and they would both walk away as undisputed billionaires. Jason slowly nodded, a dark, highly arrogant smile finally returning to his face. He told Andre to go home, pour a strong drink, and prepare his best tailored suit for the gala. They firmly believed their fabricated reality was utterly and completely bulletproof tonight. Their fabricated reality was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. I sat in the center of my darkened Manhattan penthouse, bathed entirely in the sharp blue light of my 4 massive monitors. My fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard with relentless precision. The proprietary penetration software provided by Apex Holding was currently hammering against the final encrypted firewall, protecting Andre's Cayman Island offshore accounts. Andre thought his digital security was impenetrable because he paid a discount cybersecurity firm to mask his routing numbers. He was profoundly mistaken. I isolated the critical vulnerability in his primary administrative login portal. He had linked his offshore security authentication directly to his personal domestic smartphone to make checking his illicit balances more convenient. That sheer arrogance was his fatal error. I launched a synchronized spoofing protocol mimicking his exact mobile device identifier. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding green. Access granted. The iron gates of his offshore vault swung completely open. I immediately deployed a rapid extraction script siphoning massive terabytes of hidden financial data directly onto my secure off-the-grid server farm. I watched in cold fascination as the raw, unfiltered truth of their corporate empire populated my screens. The digital ledgers unspooled before my eyes like a map of pure criminal intent. I cross-referenced the incoming offshore deposits against the official logistics startup operational budget. The numbers aligned perfectly. Andre had not just skimmed off the top. He had executed a series of automated recurring wire transfers draining $50 million from the domestic payroll accounts and routing it through 3 separate shell corporations registered in Nevada. I downloaded every single digital receipt. I captured the specific date stamps, the originating bank routing numbers, and the exact IP addresses, verifying that Andre had executed these transfers directly from his corner office desktop computer. There was no plausible deniability. He had left his digital fingerprints directly on the murder weapon. But Andre was not the only one drowning in federal crimes. I opened a subfolder hidden deep within the offshore directory labeled exclusively with Jason's initials. My husband had utilized the exact same offshore infrastructure to actively hide millions in early investor dividends, completely avoiding domestic capital gains taxes. He had deliberately siphoned those massive dividend payouts to fund his extravagant lifestyle, purchasing luxury cars and designer jewelry for his mistress, while leaving his company heavily leveraged. He had signed legally binding tax declarations under penalty of perjury, swearing he held no international assets. I downloaded the forged tax returns alongside the irrefutable proof of the hidden Cayman accounts. It was a textbook case of massive premeditated tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service would tear his entire life apart. I compiled every piece of evidence, every falsified revenue report, every illegal wire transfer, and every offshore bank statement into a single massive digital dossier. I encrypted the entire package with a military-grade cryptographic key. This was the exact explosive payload that would vaporize their $500 million valuation in a fraction of a second. I reached across my glass desk and picked up my secure encrypted satellite phone. The time for silent observation was officially over. The execution phase had begun. I dialed a highly classified direct line to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in New York. The connection secured immediately. Special Agent Collins answered on the first ring. He was an elite federal investigator I had collaborated with on 3 previous massive corporate fraud takedowns for Apex Holding. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave him the exact name of the logistics startup, the names of the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer, and a brief, devastating summary of the $50 million embezzlement and offshore tax evasion. I transmitted a secure view only linked to a heavily redacted preview of my dossier, giving him just enough raw data to justify an immediate full-scale federal intervention. Agent Collins reviewed the incoming data streams while remaining completely silent on the line. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the sharp, predatory tone of a hunter who had just spotted a massive prize. He confirmed that the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. He asked for my precise execution timeline. I laid out the strategy with cold, calculated perfection. I informed him about the $200 million signing gala scheduled for tomorrow evening at the downtown Grand Ballroom. I told him that Jason and Andre would be standing on stage completely surrounded by their board of directors, their investors, and the financial press. I instructed Agent Collins to position his federal strike team discreetly around all major exits of the venue by 7 o'clock sharp. I promised him that at exactly 8 o'clock I would publicly drop the full unredacted dossier onto the main banquet table and officially trigger the corporate collapse. The very second I revoked the Apex Holding funding and demanded the immediate repayment of our bridge loan, their entire financial facade would violently implode. This would provide the FBI with the perfect chaotic distraction to move in and secure the targets before they could attempt to flee the country. Agent Collins agreed without a single moment of hesitation. He promised his armed tactical team would be waiting in the shadows, fully prepared to execute a synchronized raid. I disconnected the call, staring at the dark screen of my phone. Every single piece of the intricate trap was locked firmly into place, leaving absolutely no margin for error. Jason wanted to throw me out into the freezing rain and erase me from his life completely. He genuinely believed he was an untouchable corporate king, ruling over a kingdom that I was actually bankrolling in secret. Tomorrow night I was going to permanently erase his entire corporate existence in front of the entire world. He would never see it coming until the heavy steel handcuffs locked securely around his wrists, permanently ending his pathetic reign of abuse and greed. The downtown Grand Ballroom was transformed into a sickening display of unearned corporate excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the polished marble floors. Tables were draped in heavy gold silk, overflowing with imported white orchids, and towering champagne pyramids that sparkled under the focused spotlights. Waitstaff in immaculate white jackets circulated smoothly through the crowd of elite investors, offering beluga caviar and premium spirits paid for entirely by the massive bridge loan they had successfully swindled from my family business. The sheer financial gluttony on display was breathtaking. Jason had explicitly demanded the most expensive venue in the city to celebrate his impending status as a tech billionaire. He wanted to project an aura of absolute invincibility to the financial press and the board of directors. The room hummed with the loud, confident chatter of Wall Street analysts and venture capitalists who genuinely believed they were witnessing the birth of the next massive logistics empire. They were completely unaware that they were actually standing inside a lavishly decorated financial slaughterhouse. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive cologne and profound unregulated greed. Jason stood near the center of the grand ballroom, absorbing the endless praise, like a starving man who had never tasted real success. He wore a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo that cost more than my entire previous annual salary. He held a crystal flute of expensive champagne, gesturing animatedly as he regaled a circle of wealthy investors with fabricated stories of his brilliant operational strategies. He laughed loudly, throwing his head back and clapping an older board member on the shoulder. He looked incredibly relaxed, entirely convinced that his ruthless eviction of his wife and his massive corporate deception had been executed with absolute perfection. He truly believed he had outsmarted the entire financial regulatory system. He openly bragged about his visionary leadership, completely ignoring the fact that his entire presentation deck had been secretly optimized by the very woman he had viciously beaten and discarded in the cold. Jason was bathing in a toxic illusion of supreme dominance, soaking up the flashing cameras of the financial press. He felt entirely untouchable, standing on the absolute peak of his fraudulent mountain, blindly waiting for the final wire transfer that would permanently solidify his fraudulent legacy. A few feet away from Jason, Naomi was demanding the spotlight like a spoiled child. She wore a tight-fitting, sparkling ruby gown, purchased entirely with embezzled corporate funds. She pushed her way into a circle of seasoned venture capitalists, positioning herself as the indispensable mastermind behind the rapid, meteoric rise of the startup. She confidently swirled her champagne, loudly bragging to the older men about her brilliant public relations strategies. She claimed she completely reshaped the corporate narrative, transforming a struggling logistics platform into a highly coveted Wall Street unicorn destined for greatness. The investors offered her polite, tight smiles, clearly uncomfortable with her brazen lack of professional decorum, but Naomi was completely blind to their dismissal. She fed on her own delusions of grandeur. She loudly boasted about her upcoming kitchen renovation, treating the corporate investors like an audience for her pathetic reality television show. She casually mentioned the impending proposal, completely ignoring the fact that he was still legally married to me. Naomi believed she had successfully conquered the corporate ladder simply by sleeping with the chief executive officer, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic federal investigation looming directly over her empty head. Near the towering champagne pyramid, Andre and Beatrice were toasting their fabricated victory with unearned confidence. Andre adjusted his pristine silk tie, looking smug and highly satisfied. He whispered conspiratorially to his wife, clearly bragging about his brilliant offshore financial maneuvers. He truly believed his Cayman Island shell corporations were a masterpiece of modern accounting, completely confident that the upcoming $200 million injection from Apex Holding would seamlessly erase his massive embezzlement trail. Beatrice clung to his arm, wearing an ostentatious diamond necklace that practically screamed of stolen capital. She laughed her harsh, grating laugh, mocking the cheap clothes I had left behind in the freezing rain just 24 hours ago. She proudly told Andre how satisfying it felt to throw my personal belongings into garbage bags, celebrating her role in my violent eviction as if it were a grand achievement. They drank their expensive champagne fully intoxicated by their shared malice and impending wealth. They felt incredibly powerful, genuinely believing they had successfully crushed a weak, defenseless woman and stolen her future without facing a single repercussion. Their absolute lack of empathy was matched only by their profound, dangerous financial ignorance. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of absolute collective delusion. The string quartet played a classical symphony in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to a massive criminal conspiracy. Every single wide smile, every clinking crystal glass, and every arrogant boast pushed their collective hubris to its absolute breaking point. Jason glanced nervously at his wildly expensive designer watch, eagerly anticipating the scheduled arrival of the Apex Holding executives for the formal contract signing. He signaled to the waitstaff to pour another massive round of vintage champagne for the board of directors, loudly declaring that tonight would go down in corporate history. He was entirely correct, but for all the wrong, devastating reasons. The heavy carved, solid gold doors at the rear of the ballroom remained firmly shut, guarding the massive marble hallway situated right outside. The entire room was completely captivated by the glittering illusion of their impending wealth, utterly blind to the lethal tactical reality actively shifting all around them. Outside the venue, highly trained undercover federal agents were moving quietly into position, securing the exterior perimeter and sealing every possible building exit. The countdown had officially reached 0. The devastating digital bomb was primed and entirely ready to detonate. The magnificent illusion of their untouchable empire was about to be violently ripped to shreds by my arrival. The heavy carved solid gold doors at the rear of the ballroom did not just open. They were forcefully thrown apart by two uniformed security guards, the heavy brass hinges groaning loudly under the sudden aggressive momentum. The resounding crash of the doors hitting the marble walls echoed like a thunderclap across the cavernous room. The elegant string quartet playing in the corner immediately faltered. The principal violinist struck a sharp, discordant note before lowering his bow entirely. The loud, arrogant chatter of the $200 million signing gala died in a matter of seconds. Silence, heavy and absolute, crashed over the room like a tidal wave. Every single head in the grand ballroom turned simultaneously toward the entrance. Harrison Caldwell stepped over the threshold first. My father did not just walk into a room. He seized total command of it. He wore a masterfully tailored midnight blue tuxedo that projected the exact terrifying authority of a man who routinely dismantled international markets before breakfast. The elite venture capitalists and Wall Street analysts standing near the entrance instantly recognized the undisputed king of the financial district. A collective breathless murmur swept through the ranks of the corporate elite. They frantically adjusted their ties and stood at rigid attention, completely awestruck by the unexpected physical presence of the Apex Holding billionaire. They expected low-level representatives to handle a minor startup acquisition. They never anticipated the absolute apex predator of the conglomerate arriving in person. Then I stepped directly into the brilliant cascading light of the crystal chandeliers, my hand resting lightly on my father's strong arm. I was absolutely breathtaking. I wore a custom floor-length Tom Ford gown crafted from heavy, midnight black silk. The fabric draped flawlessly across my figure, radiating an aura of severe, uncompromising power. The high-structured neckline and the long, elegant sleeves completely concealed the sterile medical bandages and the brutal, bloody whip marks covering my back. The dark silk provided the perfect striking canvas for the Caldwell family vault centerpiece, resting against my collarbone. A massive multi-million-dollar cascading diamond necklace caught the intense overhead spotlights, refracting the illumination into a blinding, fiery display of raw inherited wealth. I did not look like a penniless data nerd. I did not look like a desperate, discarded wife begging for shelter in the freezing rain. I looked exactly like the billionaire heiress I was born to be, arriving to formally execute a corporate slaughter. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and palpable. The elite investors parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly through the center of the grand ballroom. The whispers erupted, spreading through the wealthy attendees like a rapid, uncontrollable wildfire. The corporate executives eagerly pointed, desperately whispering to each other, trying to identify the stunning diamond-clad woman walking arm in arm with Harrison Caldwell. They assumed I was a foreign dignitary, a brilliant new executive partner, or a hidden successor to the apex throne. None of them recognized me as the quiet, unassuming spouse who used to stand silently in the background of local networking events. I kept my posture impossibly straight, my chin leveled with absolute aristocratic disdain. I let my cold, calculating gaze sweep over the terrified faces of the crowd, making them feel the sheer crushing weight of my arrival. Near the center of the room, Jason stood completely paralyzed. He was frozen mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the main entrance. He had been loudly bragging to a group of senior board members just seconds before the heavy gold doors burst apart. Now the blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He blinked rapidly, desperately trying to force his brain to process the impossible reality-shattering visual information standing right in front of him. He looked at the towering, legendary billionaire Harrison Caldwell, the man whose capital he desperately needed to save him from federal prison. Then his eyes slowly shifted to the woman resting confidently on Harrison's arm. I made direct, unwavering eye contact with my abusive husband. I offered him the exact same chilling, compliant smile I'd given him when I signed the divorce papers in our bloody bedroom. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped straight through Jason's trembling fingers. The glass plummeted toward the floor, shattering violently against the polished marble. The sharp, explosive crash of the breaking crystal was the only sound in the dead silent ballroom. Expensive vintage champagne splashed across the toes of his custom Italian leather shoes, ruining the flawless velvet fabric, but Jason did not even flinch. He could not look away. The horrific, devastating realization was violently crashing down upon him. The quiet, submissive woman he had viciously beaten, the wife he had mercilessly thrown out into the storm with a single black duffel bag, was standing before him as the absolute manifestation of the wealth he worshipped. A few feet away, Naomi looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her arrogant, triumphant posture completely collapsed. The sparkling ruby gown she had purchased with stolen corporate funds suddenly looked incredibly cheap and utterly pathetic compared to the authentic multi-million-dollar diamonds resting against my skin. She clutched her counterfeit luxury handbag tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with profound, unadulterated terror. She instinctively took a step backward, desperately trying to hide behind the older investors she had been harassing just moments ago. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her massive mistake was suffocating her. She realized in real time that she had not stolen a billionaire husband. She had actively assisted in attacking a billionaire heiress. Over by the towering champagne pyramid, Andre and Beatrice were frozen in identical stances of sheer horror. Andre's pristine Armani suit suddenly seemed entirely inadequate. As a man who prided himself on understanding the complex flow of high-level capital, his analytical brain was actively short-circuiting. He stared at Harrison Caldwell, the owner of Apex Holding, and then stared at me, the sister-in-law he had aggressively mocked and legally threatened less than 24 hours ago. Andre's jaw tightened as the catastrophic truth finally locked into place. The $200 million lifeline he needed to hide his massive offshore embezzlement was controlled entirely by the woman he had just forcefully evicted. Beatrice covered her mouth with her trembling hands, her ostentatious jewelry looking utterly ridiculous in the presence of true generational wealth. My father and I did not rush. We walked with slow, deliberate, agonizing precision directly down the center of the parted crowd. Every single click of my designer heels echoing against the marble floor served as a rhythmic, terrifying countdown for the parasites watching my approach. I did not break eye contact with Jason. I let him suffer through every grueling second of my entrance. I wanted him to feel the overwhelming, undeniable power dynamic violently shifting. He was no longer the arrogant chief executive officer ruling a logistics empire. He was just a terrified, abusive criminal standing in a puddle of spilled champagne, helplessly watching his absolute destruction, walking gracefully toward the main stage. My father and I reached the center of the grand ballroom, stopping mere feet away from the shattered crystal glass lying in the puddle of spilled champagne. The heavy silence in the room was absolute, pressing down on the terrified executives like a physical weight. Everyone waited with bated breath for Harrison Caldwell to speak, assuming he was about to address the board of directors and officially commence the funding ceremony. Instead, the fragile quiet was violently shattered by the sharp, erratic clicking of red designer stilettos stomping aggressively across the marble floor. Naomi, entirely incapable of reading the profound shift in the room's power dynamic, marched directly into our path. Her face was flushed with indignant rage, completely fueled by her blinding narcissism and profound lack of basic situational awareness. She had spent the entire day parading around the logistics startup as the undisputed queen of the corporate hierarchy, and her fragile ego simply refused to accept that her ultimate moment of glory was being hijacked by the woman she had personally thrown out into the street. She firmly planted herself directly between me and the main banquet table, crossing her arms tightly over her sparkling ruby gown. She glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. She genuinely believed I had somehow snuck past the velvet ropes just to beg Jason for financial mercy in front of his wealthy investors. She looked at my father, completely failing to recognize the most powerful financial titan in the city, and foolishly assumed he was just some wealthy sugar daddy I had desperately acquired to fund my entrance into the gala. Naomi threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that grated against the sophisticated atmosphere of the ballroom. She raised her voice deliberately, projecting her shrill tone, so the surrounding venture capitalists and board members could hear every single word. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her acrylic nail hovering just inches from my nose. She loudly demanded to know how I had managed to infiltrate a highly exclusive corporate event. She announced to the horrified crowd that I was nothing but Jason's pathetic homeless ex-wife, a desperate leech who had finally been evicted from his life so he could move on with a much younger, far more brilliant partner. She aggressively waved her hand toward the perimeter of the room, loudly snapping her fingers at the private security guards standing near the catering stations. She commanded them to immediately step forward and throw me out of the building. She proudly introduced herself as the Vice President of Communications, arrogantly claiming that she possessed the absolute unilateral authority to dictate the guest list for this monumental $200 million signing ceremony. The elite investors standing nearby physically recoiled in profound disgust. The board members exchanged looks of sheer, unmitigated horror. They were seasoned corporate veterans who instantly recognized the catastrophic social and professional suicide unfolding right in front of their eyes. Naomi was actively screaming at the personal companion of the very billionaire who held their entire financial future hostage. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my posture impossibly rigid, looking down at Naomi with the exact same cold, clinical detachment a scientist might reserve for a particularly repulsive insect. I did not need to lower myself to her pathetic level of verbal altercation. I simply allowed the deafening, mortified silence of the surrounding crowd to amplify her spectacular public humiliation. Harrison Caldwell stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of me. His imposing physical presence immediately forced Naomi to take an unsteady step backward. My father did not shout. He did not raise his voice or match her hysterical energy. He simply let a look of absolute lethal disgust wash over his aristocratic features. He turned his head slightly toward the massive security detail stationed around the perimeter of the room. His voice boomed across the silent hall, echoing off the crystal chandeliers with terrifying, indisputable authority. "Security," Harrison commanded, his tone dropping the temperature of the room to absolute zero. "Remove this frantic janitor from my daughter's sight." The word daughter struck the ballroom like a physical shockwave. A loud collective gasp erupted from the circle of venture capitalists and board members. The terrifying truth instantly rippled through the crowd. I was not a desperate, discarded wife. I was Clara Caldwell. The elite security contractors did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Two massive guards in tailored black suits surged forward from the shadows, closing the distance instantly. They flanked Naomi, gripping her bare arms with brutal, uncompromising professional efficiency. Naomi let out a piercing shriek of pure outrage as her feet were physically lifted off the polished marble floor. She kicked and thrashed violently, her red designer stilettos flying off her feet and clattering uselessly against the ground. She screamed for Jason to save her, demanding that her powerful billionaire boyfriend intervene and stop this massive indignity. Jason did absolutely nothing. He stood completely frozen in the puddle of his spilled champagne, his eyes wide with a horrific, paralyzing terror. He watched his shrieking mistress being dragged forcefully backward through the parted crowd, her counterfeit luxury handbag spilling its contents across the ballroom floor. The heavy gold doors swung open, and the guards unceremoniously hurled Naomi out into the cold corridor, sealing the massive doors shut behind her. The physical extraction took less than 30 seconds, resulting in the most immediate, deeply satisfying public humiliation I had ever witnessed. Jason's breathing became shallow and incredibly rapid. His chest heaved beneath his custom velvet tuxedo as the full, devastating reality of his massive miscalculation permanently locked into place. The pieces of the puzzle rapidly connected inside his terrified mind. Apex Holding, Harrison Caldwell, Clara Caldwell. He finally realized that he had spent the last 5 years viciously abusing the sole heiress to the exact financial empire he was currently begging for survival. He was staring directly at his own absolute executioner, and he was completely out of time to run. Jason's survival instincts finally overrode his paralyzing shock. The sheer desperation to save his crumbling $500 million empire forced his legs into motion. He lurched forward, his custom Italian leather shoes slipping wildly on the champagne-slicked marble floor. He lost his balance completely, his arms flailing as he stumbled and fell hard onto his knees. The heavy thud of his kneecaps hitting the polished stone echoed through the silent ballroom. His velvet tuxedo jacket wrinkled, and the remaining droplets of spilled champagne soaked directly into his expensive trousers. But Jason did not care about his appearance anymore. He scrambled frantically back to his feet, panting heavily, and rushed directly toward my father. He bypassed me entirely, his deeply ingrained misogyny convincing him that appealing to the powerful patriarch was his only viable path to salvation. "Mr. Caldwell Harrison, please." Jason begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic as he stopped just inches away from my father's imposing figure. "This is all a massive miscommunication. I had absolutely no idea Clara was your daughter. We have been having some minor marital difficulties, just standard domestic stress. She has been acting a bit erratically lately, completely misunderstanding my intentions. I never wanted to evict her. I was simply trying to secure a temporary space for us to cool off. Naomi is just a highly aggressive employee who overstepped her boundaries. Clara is just confused. Please do not let a simple domestic misunderstanding derail our massive corporate partnership." Jason was actually attempting to gaslight me in front of the entire financial elite of Manhattan. He stood there sweating profusely, actively trying to paint me as a hysterical, emotionally unstable wife who had blown a minor marital squabble completely out of proportion. He genuinely believed that if he used the right corporate buzzwords, he could convince a Wall Street billionaire to ignore the brutal physical abuse and proceed with the $200 million capital injection. He thought the male-dominated financial hierarchy would protect him. Harrison Caldwell did not move a single muscle. He looked down at Jason with an expression of such profound, icy contempt that it made the surrounding venture capitalists physically step backward. My father did not dignify Jason's pathetic rambling excuses with a verbal response. He simply shifted his gaze to me, yielding the floor entirely to my authority. This was my execution to perform. I stepped forward, moving smoothly into the exact space between my father and my abusive husband. The heavy silk of my Tom Ford gown brushed against Jason's ruined velvet trousers. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice or match his frantic, sweating energy. I projected the absolute chilling calmness of a senior forensic data analyst who had already solved the entire equation. I raised my hand slightly, signaling to the lead security contractor standing just behind us. The towering guard immediately stepped forward, carrying a massive, heavily reinforced black leather briefcase. He opened the custom biometric locks and handed me the contents. It was a physical manifestation of their absolute destruction. A massive 500-page bound dossier containing every single piece of extracted offshore data. Every forged tax return, every illicit wire transfer, and the complete audio transcription of the brutal physical assault. The thick binder was incredibly heavy, containing the undeniable proof of both federal corporate fraud and aggravated domestic violence. I held the massive dossier in my hands for a brief moment, letting Jason stare at the thick stack of paper. His eyes darted nervously between the black binder and my face. Beatrice, his greedy sister, had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face a mask of absolute horror, as she realized the gravity of the situation. I turned slightly toward the main banquet table, where the executives and board members had been standing just moments before. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I tossed the massive 500-page dossier directly onto the center of the table. The heavy binder hit the polished wood with a loud, resounding thud that rattled the expensive crystal champagne flutes and sent a shockwave through the dead, silent ballroom. "There are no misunderstandings, Jason," I stated, my voice echoing crisply across the silent hall. "Only data." Jason stared at the thick black binder as if it were a live, explosive device. The color drained from his face for a second time, leaving him looking hollow and completely terrified. He reached out a shaking hand toward the table, but he did not dare touch the dossier. The senior board members of his logistics startup leaned in closer, their eyes widening as they recognized the official Apex Holding audit seal stamped directly onto the front cover of the binder. They instantly knew that a document of that massive size delivered by the lead auditor of their acquiring company contained nothing but catastrophic corporate news. "You see, Jason?" I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the banquet table, completely controlling the entire room. "You assumed I spent the last 5 years staring blankly at spreadsheets while you conquered the business world. You assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness and submission. You failed to realize that silence is the absolute required condition for meticulous data collection. While you were bragging about your brilliant operational strategies and feeding your massive ego, I was silently mapping every single vulnerability in your entire financial infrastructure." I looked directly at Andre Thompson, the arrogant chief financial officer who was currently trying to shrink into the shadows near the catering stations. Andre looked like he was about to physically vomit. His pristine Armani suit offered him absolutely zero protection from the devastating federal reality crashing down around him. "I do not deal in domestic squabbles, and I certainly do not deal in emotional hysteria," I said, projecting my voice so every single investor in the room could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "I deal in undeniable, verifiable, and legally actionable facts. You stood in our bedroom and confidently told me that I was a penniless nobody dragging down your $500 million empire. You told me to walk out into the freezing rain and prepare to be crushed by your expensive lawyers. You told me I had absolutely zero power. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of Jason. He was physically trembling now, his broad shoulders slumped, his entire arrogant posture completely shattered by the icy precision of my words. The entire grand ballroom was entirely captivated by the execution. The financial press members in the back of the room were frantically typing notes on their devices, realizing they were witnessing the greatest corporate collapse of the decade. "I am not here to argue with you, Jason," I whispered, stepping so close he could clearly see the cold, merciless calculation in my eyes. "I am here to foreclose on your entire existence." Jason opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer another pathetic string of fabricated excuses, but no sound came out. His vocal cords completely failed him. He was staring directly into the abyss, fully realizing that the 500-page dossier sitting on the banquet table was the permanent gravestone for his freedom, his wealth, and his life. I stepped away from Jason, leaving him kneeling on the floor in his ruined velvet tuxedo. I turned my attention to the main podium at the front of the grand ballroom. The podium was draped in expensive gold silk, specifically set up for the highly anticipated signing ceremony. Two pristine fountain pens rested on a leather velvet pad waiting to execute a contract that would never see the light of day. I walked up the 3 short steps to the stage, the heavy silk of my gown trailing smoothly behind me. I reached out and tapped the microphone. The sharp, resonant sound echoed perfectly through the cavernous room, immediately commanding the absolute attention of every single person present. The financial press scrambled to turn their camera lenses directly toward me. The seasoned venture capitalists and board members held their breath, completely captivated by the devastating corporate drama unfolding right before their eyes. I gripped the edges of the podium, projecting my voice with crisp, unyielding authority. "Good evening to the board of directors, the esteemed investors, and the members of the financial press. My name is Clara Caldwell. I am the lead forensic auditor and senior vice president of risk assessment for Apex Holding. You are all invited here tonight to witness a monumental corporate acquisition. You were promised the dawn of a new billionaire empire in the logistics sector. I am standing before you right now to formally announce that the $200 million capital injection into this logistics startup is permanently terminated." A sharp collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The flashbulbs from the press photographers erupted in a blinding, relentless frenzy, capturing the exact second a $500 million enterprise began its lethal freefall. I raised my hand, silencing the immediate wave of frantic whispers erupting from the investor tables. The decision to pull our funding is not a matter of shifting market trends or arbitrary corporate strategy. I continued, speaking with surgical precision. Apex Holding operates on a foundation of absolute transparency and verifiable financial data. Over the past 48 hours, my forensic team has concluded a comprehensive deep dive into the internal operational budgets and offshore financial activities of this company. The 500-page dossier resting on the center banquet table contains our complete findings. It details a massive, highly coordinated, and completely illegal financial manipulation. The revenue reports presented to our acquisition committee were deliberately falsified to artificially inflate the company valuation. The executive leadership team engaged in severe corporate money laundering and massive tax evasion to hide a $50 million deficit. The board of directors physically recoiled in sheer horror. Several older men sitting near the front row clutched their chests, their faces turning a sickly shade of ash gray as the reality of their compromised investments set in. Andre Thompson, the architect of the offshore disaster, tried to back away toward the service exit, but the heavy doors remained firmly sealed by my father's elite security detail. He was completely trapped inside the slaughterhouse. I leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the next devastating blow. Due to the discovery of this catastrophic premeditated fraud, Apex Holding is not merely withdrawing our $200 million acquisition offer. We are officially activating the punitive breach of contract clause outlined in our preliminary financing agreement. I looked directly down at Jason, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, staring up at me with hollow, defeated eyes. He knew exactly what clause I was referencing. Last quarter, Apex Holding provided this logistics startup with a $15 million short-term bridge loan specifically allocated for operational expansion prior to the initial public offering. I announced, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the hall. Because the fundamental financial prerequisites of that loan were secured using fraudulent documentation, the entire balance is now immediately due in full. I am formally demanding the complete repayment of the $15 million bridge loan. The funds must be transferred back into the Apex Holding primary domestic accounts no later than 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Total pandemonium broke out across the grand ballroom. The investors began shouting, their voices overlapping in a frantic, desperate chorus of financial terror. They knew the company was entirely illiquid. They knew the $15 million bridge loan had already been squandered on luxury expenses, bloated executive salaries, and pointless corporate renovations. Demanding an immediate repayment of $15 million from a company secretly drowning in a $50 million deficit was an absolute instant death sentence. The startup was completely insolvent. The real-time corporate collapse was a spectacular, terrifying phenomenon to witness. The smartphones of every major investor and board member in the room began vibrating and chiming simultaneously. The financial analysts were frantically texting their respective brokerage firms, screaming at their associates to dump any preliminary stock options and entirely distance themselves from the radioactive logistics startup. Within a span of 60 seconds, the whispered valuation of the company plummeted from $500 million to absolutely zero. The empire was completely vaporized right there on the polished marble floor. Jason remained paralyzed on his knees, surrounded by the deafening roar of his ruined stakeholders. The wealthy venture capitalists, who had slapped his back and praised his visionary genius just 10 minutes ago, were now actively screaming for his resignation and threatening massive civil lawsuits. His board of directors loudly demanded an emergency liquidation meeting, desperately trying to salvage whatever pennies remained of their ruined investments. Jason pressed his hands over his ears, closing his eyes tightly as the sheer magnitude of his total destruction crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego. He was broken beyond repair. I stood tall behind the gold-draped podium, watching the chaotic, beautifully orchestrated devastation unfold. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I had not created this disaster. I had simply gathered the raw data of their own profound greed, compiled it into a legally binding weapon, and presented it to the world in high definition. The financial execution was completely flawless. I stepped away from the microphone, leaving the panic-stricken ballroom behind, and walked calmly back to my father's side to watch the final act of this glorious catastrophe. The chaos in the ballroom morphed from a disorganized roar into a vicious frenzy of survival. The elite investors scrambled toward the heavy gold doors, desperate to escape the blast radius of the collapsing company. Board members shouted frantically at each other, their faces red with panic, pointing accusing fingers and demanding immediate answers. In the center of the room, the fragile alliance holding Jason and his accomplices together began to violently fracture. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated the second their fabricated wealth was stripped away. Andre Thompson realized his pristine Armani suit and arrogant demeanor could no longer protect him. He was staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary for embezzlement, wire fraud, and international money laundering. His survival instincts kicked in, completely overriding any remaining shred of allegiance to his chief executive officer. Sweat poured profusely down his forehead, soaking into his expensive silk collar. He shoved his way through the panicked, shouting crowd, marching directly toward the cluster of furious board members who were currently surrounding Jason. Andre raised his voice over the deafening din of the ballroom, wildly waving his arms to command their undivided attention. He began throwing Jason entirely under the bus without a single moment of hesitation. He shouted to the executives that he was completely innocent, desperately claiming he was merely a subordinate, following strict, tyrannical corporate orders. He pointed a trembling finger at Jason, who was still recovering from his initial shock on the marble floor. Andre declared loudly to the outraged investors that Jason had violently coerced him into manipulating the financial ledgers. He spun a pathetic fabricated narrative insisting that Jason had threatened his job and his family if he did not funnel the operational funds offshore to artificially inflate the company valuation. He painted himself as a helpless victim held hostage by a megalomaniac who demanded fraudulent metrics at any cost. Jason scrambled to his feet, his velvet tuxedo ruined by the spilled champagne, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief as his own brother-in-law actively fed him to the wolves. Jason screamed back, his voice cracking with rage. He called Andre a liar, a thief, and an incompetent fool, furiously denying the allegations while trying to salvage whatever tiny fraction of his credibility remained. The two men stood inches apart, their faces contorted with pure, unadulterated hatred, practically spitting venom at each other as they desperately tried to shift the federal blame. They were acting exactly like cornered rats willing to tear each other to pieces just to survive a few seconds longer. I stood safely next to my father, calmly observing the animals fiercely biting each other inside the sinking cage. I pulled my secure smartphone from my clutch. The audio file I had extracted from my hidden recording pen earlier that day was already queued up and waiting on my screen. I did not need to shout to win this argument. I simply needed to deliver the final crushing blow. With a few quick practice taps, I bypassed the venue's standard security protocols and synced my device directly into the Grand Ballroom's massive state-of-the-art sound system. I turned the master volume output to its absolute maximum capacity and hit play. The chaotic screaming and arguing in the room was instantly drowned out by the crisp, booming playback of Andre's own deeply arrogant voice. The high-definition audio echoed powerfully off the crystal chandeliers and the marble walls, making it utterly impossible for anyone to ignore. Andre's recorded voice bragged endlessly about his brilliant financial maneuvering. The audio explicitly detailed how he systematically liquidated marital assets, established 3 separate shell trusts in the Cayman Islands, and proudly layered the transfers through anonymous corporate entities registered in Delaware and Nevada to evade domestic taxation. The recording showcased his pure, unadulterated excitement over his offshore strategies. He was not a victim following orders. He was a boastful, deeply proud criminal architect, relishing his own illegal brilliance. The entire ballroom heard him laugh about his fabricated credit debts and his foolproof plans to defraud the very investors standing in the room. Andre froze completely. The remaining blood drained from his face as he heard his own voice sealing his federal fate in front of the entire financial press. He stared up at the massive speakers mounted on the walls, his mouth hanging open in sheer, paralyzing horror. The board members surrounding him stepped back in utter disgust, realizing they were standing next to a remorseless, confessing embezzler. His desperate lies were entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. The ultimate betrayal, however, came from within his own marriage. Beatrice had been standing near the catering tables, clutching her ostentatious diamond necklace, watching her husband try to lie his way out of the disaster. When the crystal-clear audio of his arrogant confession blasted through the room, her expression morphed from intense fear to absolute, unhinged fury. She realized that Andre had not just hidden money from me, he had jeopardized her entire luxurious lifestyle, her social standing, and the future of her children by committing massive federal crimes and leaving an undeniable digital trail. Beatrice lunged forward, her expensive designer heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor like aggressive gunfire. She shoved past a stunned venture capitalist and marched directly up to Andre. She did not ask for clarification. She did not wait for an explanation. She raised her hand and delivered a vicious, resounding slap directly across his face. The sharp crack echoed loudly, silencing a pocket of the nearby crowd. She began screaming at him at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice slicing through the remaining noise in the ballroom. She called him a stupid, greedy idiot who had just destroyed her perfect life. She hit his chest with her fists, completely abandoning her carefully crafted image of wealthy elegance. She shrieked about how she would lose her country club membership, her beautiful house, and her entire social circle, because he could not execute a simple financial maneuver without getting caught on tape. I watched the absolute chaos unfold with cold, unyielding satisfaction. Their toxic family dynamic was fully exposed, stripped of its glamorous veneer. They were turning on each other with the exact same ruthless cruelty they had always reserved for me. The loyalty they proudly claimed to possess was nothing but a fragile illusion built on stolen money and shared malice. Now that the money was gone, their malice was devouring them alive. Their malice devoured them alive. Jason stood in the collapsing ballroom, isolated amidst his family's shrieking matches. He watched Beatrice attack Andre, listening to the relentless audio loop. The finality of his ruin pierced his impenetrable ego. He was a broke, impending federal convict. His eyes darted across the fleeing investors, locking directly onto me. The last remnants of his sanity snapped violently. The magnitude of his public destruction ignited a blinding rage inside his chest. He blamed me for his downfall, incapable of accepting responsibility for his greed. He let out a loud, guttural roar, ignoring my billionaire father and the journalists documenting his every move. He balled his hands into tight fists and charged straight across the marble floor. Jason lunged at me with pure murderous intent, his face contorted into a hideous mask of violent fury, his jaw unhinged as he screamed vulgarities, promising to finish the physical beating he started in our master bedroom. He desperately wanted to completely destroy the woman who systematically dismantled his fraudulent kingdom. He closed the distance with terrifying speed, his ruined velvet tuxedo jacket billowing. He raised his right fist high, aiming a devastating strike directly at my face. He genuinely believed he could exact his brutal revenge right there in front of the elite Wall Street investors. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, watching his pathetic charge with cold, calculating anticipation. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. I expertly orchestrated every single variable. Jason never came close to reaching me. Before he could swing his raised fist, the tactical trap I meticulously laid with Special Agent Collins violently snapped shut. 4 men dressed in white catering jackets and 2 individuals disguised as venture capitalists instantly broke their cover. They surged forward from the shadows with lethal military precision. They were undercover federal agents flawlessly tracking Jason's movements since the gala began. The lead agent tackled Jason from the side, striking him with the force of a freight train. The sheer momentum lifted Jason completely off his expensive Italian leather shoes. He slammed face first into the hard-polished marble floor with a sickening thud. The impact forcefully expelled the air from his lungs, reducing his furious roar to a breathless wheeze. Sharp pieces of shattered crystal dug deeply into his custom suit. 2 federal agents immediately descended upon him, driving their heavy knees ruthlessly into the center of his back to pin him flat against the cold stone. They grabbed his flailing arms, twisting them sharply behind his back with uncompromising professional force. The loud metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply, slicing cleanly through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Jason thrashed wildly against the floor, kicking his legs and screaming in sheer panic, completely unable to comprehend how his glorious signing ceremony instantaneously morphed into a brutal federal arrest. He strained his neck, pressing his bruised, bleeding cheek against the wet marble, and glared up at me with eyes full of terrifying, impotent rage. The agents held him down effortlessly, neutralizing his physical threat. The financial journalists and press photographers, initially paralyzed by the sudden eruption of violence, snapped back into action. They realized they were no longer just covering a massive corporate bankruptcy and a dramatic executive fraud scandal. They were actively documenting a violent physical assault unfolding directly in front of the apex-holding billionaire patriarch. The press corps rushed forward, creating a tight semicircle around the scene. Massive television cameras pivoted sharply, their bright red recording lights glowing ominously. Hundreds of high-definition flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe effect, casting harsh white light across Jason's humiliated, pinned form. They captured every pathetic angle of the disgraced chief executive officer writhing helplessly in a puddle of spilled champagne. The reporters shouted frantic questions, demanding statements entirely hungry for the climax of this historic corporate massacre. This was my final strategic maneuver. The financial ruin was complete, but the moral execution required one last piece of undeniable damning evidence. I stepped deliberately toward the frantic wall of flashing cameras, ensuring I commanded the center of every focal lens in the grand ballroom. I turned my back directly toward the aggressive line of press photographers and the surrounding board of directors. I reached behind my neck, my fingers finding the hidden silk clasp securing the high-structured cowl of my custom Tom Ford gown. With a single downward motion, I unfastened the latch and let the heavy black fabric drape dramatically down to my waist. I stood perfectly straight, under the intensely bright spotlights, deliberately exposing my severely beaten bare back to the entire watching world. The bright white medical bandages covering my skin were starkly visible against the dark silhouette of the dress. The heavy gauze barely concealed the savage, brutally stitched whip marks crisscrossing my shoulder blades. The raw, jagged edges of the deep lacerations Jason had violently inflicted just hours prior peeked out from the edges of the medical tape, angry and red. The horrific physical evidence of his domestic savagery was broadcast instantly in flawless high-definition detail. A profound, collective gasp of horror sucked the remaining oxygen directly out of the grand ballroom. The clicking of the camera shutters doubled in speed, the blinding flashbulbs reflecting off the trauma etched permanently into my skin. The narrative shifted instantly and irrevocably. The wealthy investors and corporate media witnessed the horrifying truth. Jason Cole was not just a greedy corporate embezzler, he was a savage, remorseless monster who brutally whipped his wife for a fraction of a fabricated illusion. I turned my head slightly, looking over my exposed shoulder to stare down at Jason. He lay pinned against the cold marble, completely silenced by the horrific public exposure of his darkest, most violent secret. His absolute destruction was finally complete. Special Agent Collins confidently stepped directly into the glaring perimeter of the flashing press cameras. He did not shield his face from the press. He wanted the entire financial world to witness the uncompromising power of federal law enforcement. He looked down at Jason, who was still gasping for air against the cold marble floor, a pathetic broken shell of a man. Two armed tactical agents hauled Jason roughly to his feet, yanking his arms upward to secure the heavy steel cuffs. His ruined velvet tuxedo tore at the shoulder seam, a fitting symbol of his shredded corporate facade. Jason Cole. Agent Collins announced, his voice carrying the lethal weight of absolute governmental authority. You are under arrest. You are being charged with aggravated felony assault, massive corporate tax evasion, and multiple counts of federal wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Across the ballroom, another squad of federal agents converged on Andre Thompson. The arrogant chief financial officer had tried to quietly slip out through the kitchen service doors, but he found himself staring directly into the barrels of federal weapons. They slammed Andre forcefully against the polished mahogany wall, thoroughly patting him down before aggressively ratcheting the handcuffs around his wrists. His expensive Armani suit jacket was yanked off his shoulders. The agents dragged him back into the main hall to face his reckoning alongside his disgraced chief executive officer. Agent Collins recited the exact same federal rights to Andre, ensuring the charges of international money laundering and corporate embezzlement echoed clearly across the dead silent room. The elite venture capitalists and Wall Street analysts watched the brutal arrest with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound terror. They aggressively backed away from the two criminals, treating Jason and Andre like highly infectious diseases. No board member stepped forward to offer legal assistance. No wealthy investor shouted in their defense. The corporate world is ruthlessly Darwinian, and Jason had just become a massive liability. They severed their ties in real time, pulling out their smartphones to explicitly instruct their respective legal teams to draft immediate severability clauses and public distancing statements. Jason hung his head, his chin resting against his chest, as the agents physically restrained him. He could not look at the cameras. He could not look at the sneering faces of the billionaires he had desperately tried to impress. He was completely stripped of his unearned power, exposed to the world as a violent coward and a pathetic financial fraud. Andre fought against the agent's grip, loudly protesting his innocence, shouting that he was a respected executive, but his arrogant cries fell on entirely deaf ears. The heavy steel chains clinked rhythmically as the heavily armed federal agents began marching both defeated men toward the grand front exit of the luxurious ballroom. The flashing strobes of the press photographers illuminated their humiliating perp walk, immortalizing their total defeat for tomorrow morning. Beatrice watched her entire universe disintegrate in a matter of seconds. The illusion of her untouchable wealth, her exclusive country club memberships, and her elite social standing evaporated into thin air. She saw her husband being dragged away in chains. She saw her brother utterly disgraced. The devastating reality of federal asset forfeiture suddenly struck her. The government would seize her mansions, her luxury cars, and her offshore bank accounts. She would be left with absolutely nothing. Panic consumed her completely. She abandoned every single shred of her carefully cultivated aristocratic dignity. She shoved her way past the stunned investors and threw herself directly onto the champagne-soaked marble floor. She wildly lunged forward on her knees, her trembling hands desperately grabbing massive handfuls of my heavy black silk Tom Ford gown. She yanked on the expensive fabric, completely uncaring that she was kneeling in spilled alcohol and shattered crystal. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her meticulous designer makeup. She tilted her head back, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Clara." "Please," Beatrice shrieked, her shrill voice echoing frantically over the mechanical clicks of the press cameras. "You cannot do this. You have to stop them. Call off the FBI. Tell your father to drop the charges. Think about my children. They are your niece and nephew. You cannot send their father to a federal penitentiary. They will be ruined. We will have absolutely nothing left. Have some mercy, Clara. I am begging you. Have some mercy." I looked silently down at the pathetic, sobbing woman who was clinging desperately to the delicate hem of my expensive dress. This was the exact same woman who had marched into my living room 24 hours ago with black garbage bags. The woman who had violently ripped my cherished memories from the shelves and laughed out loud as she shattered my belongings. She cheered for my financial ruin. She had ruthlessly mocked my cheap clothes and aggressively celebrated my violent eviction into the freezing rain. She possessed absolutely zero empathy when she thought she held the ultimate power. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her manufactured tears. I reached down and forcefully yanked my expensive silk gown completely out of her desperate, grasping hands. I stepped back, creating a cold, deliberate physical boundary between her pathetic begging and my absolute authority. I stared directly into her terrified, weeping eyes, letting the freezing temperature of my gaze completely paralyze her. "When you threw my life into a garbage bag, did you think of mercy?" I asked, my voice slicing cleanly through the ballroom like a sharpened scalpel. "You demanded my complete destruction without a single second of hesitation." Beatrice choked on a sob, her hands trembling wildly as she reached out again, finding only empty air. I stood tall, my physical posture unyielding. "The state will raise your kids better than a money launderer," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow. The gavel struck the heavy oak block with a deafening crack that echoed through the federal courthouse. That single sharp sound permanently sealed the destruction of the logistics empire. The swift and brutal justice system of the United States government did not offer any leniency for arrogant men who thought they could outsmart the Securities and Exchange Commission. The highly publicized trial lasted exactly 14 days. My forensic data was absolutely impenetrable. The defense attorneys Jason desperately hired, using his last remaining lines of credit, surrendered almost immediately when they saw the clear digital trail of tax evasion and the high-definition recording of the domestic assault. Jason stood before the stern federal judge wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his public defender. His previous bespoke velvet tuxedos and arrogant posturing were completely gone. The judge looked down at him with profound disgust and delivered the maximum penalty allowable under the law. Jason was sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly denied any possibility of early parole. Jason collapsed back into his hard wooden chair. The massive realization finally hit him. He would spend the next decade and a half locked inside a sterile concrete cell surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. His youth, his unearned wealth, and his fabricated tech billionaire legacy were permanently erased from existence. Federal marshals immediately clamped heavy steel cuffs around his wrists and dragged him out of the courtroom. He did not look back. He had absolutely nothing left to look back at. Andre faced a similarly devastating fate in the neighboring courtroom. His desperate attempts to negotiate a plea deal by throwing Jason under the bus completely failed. The federal prosecutors did not need his pathetic cooperation because my encrypted dossier already provided every single piece of evidence required to bury him. Andre was formally convicted on 47 counts of international money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. The slick, confident chief financial officer who proudly marched into my home wearing a custom Armani suit was stripped of his expensive clothes and forced into a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. The government systematically dismantled his complex web of Cayman Island shell corporations, seizing every single stolen dollar and returning the capital directly to the defrauded investors. Andre lost his freedom, his professional license, and his entire identity. He was reduced to a simple inmate number in a massive federal database. His arrogant belief that he could outsmart the global banking system ended with him staring blankly at the iron bars of a federal holding facility. His corporate dominance was replaced by the harsh, violent reality of federal incarceration. The blast radius of the corporate collapse completely incinerated Naomi. She foolishly believed she could detach herself from the sinking ship by claiming she was just an innocent employee following executive orders. The federal investigators quickly shattered that illusion. They pulled the corporate expense reports and easily linked her directly to the embezzled funds. She was formally indicted as an active accessory to massive corporate fraud. The government immediately froze her bank accounts and officially revoked her passport, eliminating any possibility of her fleeing the country to avoid prosecution. She managed to avoid actual prison time by agreeing to testify against Jason, but she did not escape her financial execution. Naomi was slapped with millions of dollars in federal restitution penalties and crippling legal debts that she could never hope to repay. Her stolen luxury vehicles, her designer wardrobes, and her expensive jewelry were aggressively repossessed by federal marshals. Today, Naomi works the graveyard shift at a cheap, brightly lit diner off a noisy interstate highway. She wears a stained polyester uniform and spends her nights scrubbing greasy, flat-top grills and serving cheap coffee to exhausted truck drivers. The young woman who proudly paraded around an executive suite demanding imported marble countertops now relies entirely on small cash tips just to afford her basic rent. Her fabricated dreams of marrying a billionaire vanished completely, leaving her trapped in a permanent, inescapable cycle of crushing poverty. Beatrice suffered a financial annihilation that was equally catastrophic. The federal asset forfeiture protocols were utterly ruthless. Because Andre had used the stolen corporate funds to finance their extravagant lifestyle, the government legally seized absolutely everything they owned. Federal agents marched into her sprawling suburban mansion and confiscated the property. They towed away her imported sports cars and seized the contents of her expensive jewelry boxes. Beatrice was aggressively stripped of her elite country club memberships and completely shunned by her wealthy social circle. Her former friends treated her like a highly contagious disease, refusing to return her desperate phone calls or offer any financial assistance. With her husband locked in a federal penitentiary and her bank accounts frozen by the authorities, Beatrice was forced to formally declare total bankruptcy. The woman who haughtily threw my personal belongings into black garbage bags and mocked my taste was brutally evicted from her own life. She had to pack her remaining cheap clothes into cardboard boxes and move her family into a tiny, dilapidated trailer park on the absolute outskirts of the city. She currently lives in a cramped, rusting metal box with peeling linoleum floors and a leaking roof. She spends her days clipping grocery store coupons and waiting in long lines at the local food bank, constantly looking over her shoulder to see the judgmental stares of her new neighbors. Her previous arrogance and vicious cruelty ultimately bought her a one-way ticket to absolute squalor. The universe delivered its brutal, unapologetic karma, ensuring that every single person who conspired to destroy my life was completely buried under the catastrophic weight of their own monumental greed. I stand today on the private glass balcony of the Apex Holding Tower, 65 stories above the bustling, chaotic streets of Manhattan. The crisp, freezing morning wind whips aggressively around me, but I am perfectly insulated inside my heavy, tailored cashmere coat. I hold a small, delicate porcelain cup of dark, bitter espresso, letting the rich heat radiate through my palms and ground me entirely in the present moment. Far below my feet, the city moves in a relentless, synchronized rhythm. The yellow taxis look like tiny, insignificant insects, and the towering corporate headquarters of rival logistics firms seem incredibly small and fragile from this breathtaking, elevated vantage point. This is my absolute kingdom. This is the financial empire I rightfully inherited, fiercely protected, and masterfully expanded. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, allowing myself a rare, profound moment of undisturbed tranquility. The violent, turbulent storm that completely consumed my past is permanently over, replaced by the quiet, unshakable stability of total command. I close my eyes and let my mind wander back to that horrific night in the suburban master bedroom. I can still vividly recall the exact rough texture of the blood-stained cream carpet pressing harshly against my bare knees. I can clearly remember the suffocating sweet smell of stale wine on Naomi's breath and the heavy, terrifying swoosh of Jason's leather belt violently slicing through the air. In that exact moment of profound physical agony and severe emotional humiliation, I was completely supposed to break. Society expects the abused, discarded wife to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. They fully expected me to scream, to beg for mercy, and to desperately bargain for a miserable fraction of my own dignity. But I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of my destruction. I chose a vastly different path. I chose the path of the silent, calculating predator. The greatest, most destructive lie we are ever taught is that volume equals power. We are heavily conditioned to believe that when we are brutally attacked, we must immediately strike back with explosive emotional anger. We are told to yell, to argue, and to desperately defend our honor in the heat of the agonizing moment. But screaming only feeds the narcissist. Arguing only provides your abuser with the exact emotional validation they deeply, pathetically crave. It hands them the precise roadmap to your deepest vulnerabilities. When you react emotionally, you are playing entirely by their rules on their specifically chosen battlefield. I realized long ago that true, insurmountable power resides in absolute, unwavering silence. Silence is an invisible, impenetrable shield. It actively starves the abuser of their desired reaction, and more importantly, it provides you with the perfect, undisturbed cover to meticulously gather your ammunition. While Jason and Andre loudly bragged about their brilliant corporate strategies and their untouchable offshore bank accounts, I was quietly collecting every single data point. I turned my physical pain into a highly calibrated tracking mechanism. I did not waste my valuable energy throwing objects, crying, or hurling useless insults. I channeled every single ounce of my burning rage into executing a flawless, methodical digital audit. I let their massive, unchecked greed do all the heavy lifting. Greedy people are inherently disastrously sloppy. Their profound arrogance makes them incredibly blind to their own fatal vulnerabilities. When you stay completely silent, they inevitably start talking. They boast, they confess, and they eagerly weave the exact financial and legal noose that will ultimately snap their own necks. You just have to be perfectly patient enough to let them finish tying the knot before you swiftly kick the chair out from under them. My physical scars have fully healed now. The brutal, jagged lines across my back have faded into thin, pale silver marks. I do not hide them, and I absolutely do not view them as pathetic symbols of victimhood. They are permanent physical reminders of the exact cost of my freedom and the incredible unbreakable strength of my own endurance. They represent the precise moment I stopped being a passive, yielding participant in my own life and aggressively transformed into the sole, undisputed architect of my destiny. I survived the absolute worst of human betrayal, and I fiercely forged that severe trauma into a weapon of undeniable federal justice. I reclaimed my family's legacy, protected our massive financial empire, and completely eradicated the arrogant parasites who mistakenly thought they could casually consume my future. I placed my empty espresso cup onto the sleek glass table beside me and gripped the cold metal railing of the balcony. I look out toward the limitless horizon, feeling the immense pulsing energy of the city vibrating beneath my feet. I am Clara Caldwell. I am a survivor, a senior forensic data analyst, and a billionaire heiress who outright refused to be erased. I wrote the final devastating chapter of their miserable story, and I am the only one left standing to read it. Now I turn my attention directly to you. Yes, you. The person listening to this story who might be sitting in the dark right now feeling trapped, undervalued, or entirely broken by someone else's cruelty. Perhaps you are dealing with a highly toxic partner, a manipulative family member, or a deeply abusive environment that makes you feel completely powerless and utterly alone. I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are never powerless. Do not ever let their loud, arrogant voices convince you that your silence is a sign of weakness. Your silence is your ultimate, impenetrable sanctuary. Use it to fiercely protect your mind. Use it to quietly gather your strength, and use it to meticulously plan your flawless exit strategy. Do not fight them with pointless tears or desperate screams. Fight them with undeniable data, relentless preparation, and absolute cold calculation. When the timing is absolutely perfect, when your trap is fully primed, and your evidence is completely airtight, you will step out of the shadows and aggressively take your life back. You will let their own monstrous hubris dictate their inevitable downfall, and you will walk away without a single fleeting glance backward. So I leave you with one final essential question to ask yourself today. Will you continue to let them arrogantly write the story of your defeat? Or are you finally ready to silently gather your data, step into your absolute power, and relentlessly execute your own magnificent, unapologetic triumph? The story of Clara Caldwell offers a profound and unconventional lesson on trauma and justice. True power does not reside in volume or immediate emotional retaliation, but rather in the cold, calculated discipline of silence. When confronted with the agonizing betrayal of a ruthless husband and a parasitic family, societal norms often dictate that the victim should scream, beg, or fight back in the heat of the moment. However, Clara's journey dismantles this expectation completely. By absorbing physical and emotional abuse without uttering a single cry, she denies her abusers the very validation they desperately seek. This narrative teaches us that reacting emotionally to toxic individuals only forces us to play on their battlefield, abiding by their distorted rules. Narcissists and manipulators thrive on chaos and emotional distress. It fuels their ego and gives them a roadmap to our deepest vulnerabilities. Clara demonstrates that silence, conversely, is an impenetrable shield. It starves the abuser of their desired response and provides the necessary quiet space to meticulously gather undeniable data. While her antagonists boldly boasted about their offshore accounts and flaunted their fabricated wealth, her quiet composure actively allowed them to weave their own legal noose through their sheer, unchecked arrogance. Ultimately, this reflection reminds us that justice is rarely born from chaotic screaming matches or desperate pleas for mercy. It is built patiently in the shadows, brick by brick, using the irrefutable facts and evidence that greedy people carelessly leave behind when they believe nobody is watching. We learn that we do not have to mirror the cruelty of our abusers to defeat them. We simply need to outsmart them. Instead of raising your voice the next time someone tries to diminish your worth, silently gather your strength and begin executing your own master plan for a triumphant future.